Right, why don't we get started? Good morning. My name is Simone Turek-Lee. I'm with John Burton Advocates for Youth. Thanks for joining us today at this virtual policy briefing on homelessness among unaccompanied youth, where we'll learn from Washington State and national experts on what they're doing to address youth homelessness and homelessness in general, and consider how we can learn from the information shared today to help us here in California to maximize our investment in youth homelessness. So we're going to dive in just to some of our technical details here, some housekeeping. We do a question and answer session at the very end, and we do that via what's entered into the questions box. So please, at any point throughout today's webinar, and enter your questions into the questions box. We'll be collecting them, and then we'll go over them at the end. And we also record these. We record all of our webinars. We put them in the resource library on our website. So if you visit our resource library, you can get any recording or any slide deck from webinar we've done in that library. And then we also email everyone who's registered for today's event. We will email you that information as well later today. So we're going to kick off this policy briefing with a welcome from Senator Caballero, who is our co-host, but unfortunately had a last-minute scheduling change and has instead sent some remarks that I'll read on her behalf that she's requested that we relay to all of you. Then we'll do some context setting to remind ourselves sort of where we are here in California with California's, with our state investment in youth homelessness. We'll hear from two pairs of expert panelists. First, Community Solutions, who will share about their Built for Zero approach to functionally ending homelessness in communities across the U.S. Then we'll hear from Away Home Washington, who will talk about their Anchor Community Initiative to functionally end youth homelessness in their state. And we'll come back together to consider where California can go from here and end with our Q&A session. So as I shared, Senator Caballero was unable to be with us today, but did send in some opening remarks that she had intended to make to all of us today. So before I read those, just, Senator Caballero represents the state's 12th Senate district. This is a Central Valley district, includes Merced. Senator Caballero is currently the chair of the Senate Governance and Finance Committee, and she is a champion for housing and homelessness issues. So although she isn't here with us right now, I do want to acknowledge her and thank her for recognizing the importance of housing and homelessness issues in our state. So now for her statement. So Senator Caballero sends her deepest regrets for the last-minute scheduling change. She's been invited by the governor to attend a housing policy signing ceremony where her bill SB 6 and other key housing bills will be signed into law. The senator does wish to have her opening remarks read and is sincerely grateful for the invitation to join John Burton Advocates for Youth, Community Solutions, and Away Home Washington, and of course, all of the participants who are here today virtually. Senator Caballero is proud of the work California has done over the last several years to invest in solutions to address homelessness. In 2017, our state established the California Interagency Council on Homelessness, which works toward ending homelessness in our state, including youth homelessness. And recently, California began investing significantly in addressing homelessness, especially for unhoused youth. Since 2018, California has invested $533 million in services for youth homelessness, which has helped over 11,000 individuals. More recently, we've refined how our state's main homelessness funding is administered and programmed, and have established new planning and accountability measures aimed at understanding the impact of this funding. And while this is a major improvement, unfortunately, too many youth and young adults are still housing insecure. In California, there are 13,299 unaccompanied youth and parenting youth experiencing homelessness, according to the 2020 point-in-time count. This is nearly a third of the nation's homeless youth population and 8% of California's homeless population generally. While sizable compared to other states, reaching a point at which we can address and serve all youth experiencing homelessness in California is possible if we maximize our investment and have the data capability to measure our progress and the impact of our interventions. Senator Caballero again wishes to express her gratitude for the opportunity to speak today and apologizes for not being able to present the remarks herself. Like all of you, she is eager to learn from other jurisdictions across the US that have the goal of reaching functional zero homelessness and consider whether these promising strategies might inform California's approach to youth homelessness. So now I'd like to begin by just acknowledging the Senator for co-hosting with us here in spirit and transition into introducing our panelists today. We are here with Melanie Lewis-Dickerson, the Portfolio Lead for Large-Scale Change at Community Solutions. Hi, Melanie. And Beth Sandor, Principal at Community Solutions. Welcome. We're also joined by Julie Patino, the Executive Director of Away Home Washington, and Ashley Barnes-Cock, the Anchor Community Initiative Project Director at Away Home Washington. Welcome, both of you as well. And thanks to the four of you for joining us today. Each of our presenters will provide more context for their organizations and what they do when they present. But before I pass it over to them, I do want to provide some context for this event today. So as Senator Caballero shared, and I want to start by sort of anchoring us here, the data on the screen is from the 2020 point in time count, and at least 13,299 youth were experiencing homelessness in January of 2020 here in our state. And that includes 12,172 people who are considered unaccompanied youth, meaning they're 24 years of age or younger, and they're not in the custody or in a household of a parent or a guardian or an adult who is responsible for them. They are essentially experiencing homelessness by themselves. This also includes 1,127 young people who are custodial parents themselves. So meaning they have children of their own that they are experiencing homelessness with. So these numbers do not include family homelessness numbers unless the youth is the head of the household. So this is specific to youth homelessness. And to give just some further context, and I think as the Senator also shared, this figure accounts for about a third of our nation's homeless population and 8% of California's total population, or total homeless population, a third of the nation's homeless youth population. So one thing that we know about homelessness among youth is that there are specific risk factors or demographics that make a young person more likely to experience homelessness. Basically, we are not all experiencing things equally. A 2017 study by Chapin Hall showed us that youth who didn't finish high school are at 346% more likely or higher risk for homelessness. Parenting youth who are not married are at 200% higher risk. Youth with household incomes below $24,000 are at 162% higher risk. Youth who identify as LGBTQ are at 120% higher risk. Black or African American youth are at 83% higher risk. And then that study and what non-white Hispanic youth are at 33% higher risk. And that study also showed that youth who are both Black and LGBTQ are then at an even greater risk. So it really does look at how things differ for young people and how we're all experiencing life differently. And today you'll hear about how some of the work being discussed is really able to explore these risks and how youth are served to ensure equity. So while we do have high rates of youth homelessness in California, we are observing recent progress. There is there are good things happening here. First, we've seen an unprecedented level of investment in homelessness and youth homelessness through the establishment of youth set-asides in some of our state's mainstream homelessness funding programs. And a youth set-aside is when a specified percentage of overall funding for a program is designated specifically for addressing homelessness among youth. We also have as the Senator mentioned, a state interagency council on homelessness now since 2017. And this council, which was previously called the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council, is charged with administering the majority of that funding mentioned in that $533 million And they're also charged with specific goals related to homelessness. In 2018, SB 918, authored by Senator Scott Wiener, added 5 goals specific to youth homelessness to those goals, bringing the total to 18. So 5 of the council's 18 goals are related to youth. And the council has developed an action plan for preventing and ending homelessness in California, which works toward those goals essentially. Thanks to the youth set aside, all 44 of California's local homeless continuums of care administer funding for youth homelessness. And, this means we've really now as a state sort of brought homeless youth providers into the fold, to the table in many communities where this previously may not have been the case. With this investment, we've seen at least 11,000 youth served just since 2019. And this is only really capturing one of the 3 programs in that $533 million. So it's definitely higher than that, I will say. And I see people are asking for the slides. Angie, would you mind putting a link to the slides so if people want to download them into the chat? So if people want to download them, they can pull them from there. Thank you. And lastly, we took a look at early data provided at the local level from this year's point in time count, which takes place every January. And of the 8 largest cities that have released their data, the homeless continuums of care that represent those 8 largest cities, we've seen a 25% decrease in youth homelessness. Now, of course, this is preliminary. The data has to be certified and published by HUD for all jurisdictions. And that will happen in the coming months, but this is early data that's pretty encouraging. And it does, people probably want to know, does it include LA? Because LA is a sizable portion. Yes, it does include LA. We wanted on the next slide to just sort of show everyone what is this 533 million figure we're throwing out there. So this investment really consists of what you see on the screen. It started in 2018 with the Homeless Emergency Aid Program, or HEAP, with a $500 million investment. And local jurisdictions were required to spend a minimum of 5% of their HEAP funding on addressing youth homelessness specifically. That 5% totaled 25 million. So you can kind of see going from the top down kind of how this chart works. Then HEAP was essentially replaced with HAP, the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program, in 2019. And this has continued to be the main vehicle for addressing homelessness in California since then. And you can see the HAP youth set aside percentage increased. It started 8, it then increased up to 10, starting in 2021, which was round 3, or which is round 3. This was to match it with the percent of youth that are in the overall California homeless population over a 5-year average. So you heard me say 8% earlier. When you look over a 5-year average in California, it's in fact 10%. But hopefully, as we make this progress, we will continue to see that drop. And then you can also see that the overall HAP investment got larger as our budget got healthier in our state. So it's currently at $1 billion, which is $100 million for youth, 10%. And in 2021, another state program adopted the youth set-aside policy, Home Key, at the 8% figure. And Home Key provides funding for capital development. And you can see that it was also funded in the $1 billion range. So that is the gist of this programming. I should also just point out that all of this programming is one time. So this is not ongoing funding, but we have seen year after year commitments, for this funding since 2018 consistently. So with all this investment, the questions that have been raised pretty consistently, about our state's homelessness, services, programming, investments, have been, are these investments working? Are we making progress? What's the full extent of our state's need? Are people being served with the right interventions? Are people remaining housed? Are we seeing the impact sustained? Are people being housed more quickly? So are we closing that time period that it takes for people to get housing support? And are people being served equitably? So I've heard a lot of these questions over the years. And it obviously takes time to answer some of these questions. But I know that we've definitely heard these questions from the legislature, and the state has responded by, building in some accountability measures into HAP, some different reporting requirements, a planning requirement. And so I think we're currently trying to answer these questions. And these are all really important questions. I hear people say, we love hearing stories. We love to understand the individual human impact of these programs, but we also want to see data on the impact, right? And the response to that has been, ramping up data. I think that, today, where this really ties into today is that, the people on this call can generally answer these questions, many of these questions, for the programs that they are working to put up and providing assistance to, in the communities that they're working with, working toward achieving functional zero homelessness, or in Washington State, youth homelessness. And so I thought that, this would be a really interesting, we really wanted to share this information with you today, because I know that these questions are still out there and people still want answers to those questions. And so today we'll really, I think, hear from our panelists on how they go about getting this information and how this can drive, how data can really drive us to a better endpoint. An endpoint where we've, functionally ended homelessness. So we're hoping that we'll take from today, how can we maximize our dollar investment in California? How can we get sort of the most juice out of the lemon? How can we make our dollar do the most? That's really, at the end of the day, I think, what everyone wants to see with these state investments. And how can we get to a place where we've come closer to functionally ending youth homelessness? So I want to, at this point, turn it over to our panelists. We're going to start off with community solutions, and I'm going to pass it to Melanie Lewis Dickerson and Beth Sandor to walk us through some of their work.
Great. Thank you, Simone. It's wonderful to be with all of you today and to share some of our work, and excited to be part of this conversation. You can go to the next slide. I'm Beth Sandor, as Simone said. I, since 2015, have been leading a national effort called Built for Zero, which is a movement of now 105 communities in the US and 68 communities outside the US that are working with 4 international partners to measurably end and reduce homelessness. In the US, a community, just for folks on the call, is defined usually as the continuum of care geography. Usually that's a county or a multi-county jurisdiction. And we launched Built for Zero back in 2015 to really invite communities into partnership with us to figure out what does it take to get to move away as a community from counting up to outcomes like number of housing placements, number of dollars spent, number of people served, and instead count down to an end to homelessness across a jurisdiction. You can move to the next slide. Seeing the list of questions that are kind of open questions on youth homelessness in the state, those were very similar to the questions we have. Like the fundamental question we've been trying to answer with the work of Built for Zero and our partnership with communities across the country is, how do we answer this question? Are all of our programs and investments adding up to the thing we really want, which is equitable reductions in homelessness over time? And if our work, our programs and investment, all the time and energy we're all spending is not adding up to those equitable reductions in homelessness for one or more populations, how quickly would we know, and how quickly could we pivot our work in response to that information? So that's been the fundamental question we've been working on answering with these communities in partnership. Next slide. So our first kind of theory of change or hypothesis when we launched this effort about what it would take to answer that question was to shift away from seeing homelessness as a technical solution that had a recipe or a series of tasks you could plan out that would get you to an end state, and instead really lean into the complexity of homelessness and how dynamic it is. And to do that, when you look at how people have solved some of the most complex issues in our country or around the world, things like smallpox, things like addressing polio, you really need to shift to an iterative framework, one that assumes you don't actually know the solution up front. And what you're trying to do is learn your way into that solution. And so our hypothesis was to leverage some problem-solving frameworks from other sectors, from healthcare, around quality improvement. And this, what you see on the screen, is the model for improvement, which was developed decades ago now by the Associates in Process Improvement and was taught to us by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and is a framework for iterating into solutions. And so you start with the end state. What are we trying to accomplish? Can we be very clear on what success looks like and how we would measure it? How would we know that a change in our system is an actual improvement towards that end state? And then what changes can we make that we think will result in an improvement? And again, that's all just a hypothesis. And how we go about making those changes is through iteration, what we call plan, do, study, act cycles. But it's really the scientific method, right? It's having a hypothesis, it's testing that hypothesis, and then acting on the learning from that to change our behavior and to continue to learn. And so going into Built for Zero, our theory was, if we can start working in the homeless response system to shift away from only technical solutions to this iterative framework, we will get there faster than if we assume we have the answers up front. Next slide. And so since we launched in 2015, there are, in addition to the undergirding of this kind of continuous improvement discipline that's necessary, there are about 5 other things we have seen be present in communities that are seeing measurable reductions over time, that are enabling them to get those results, or getting to functional zero for 1 or more populations. I'm going to dive into 4 of the 5 things you see up here, and then Melanie is going to take you into the effective implementation structure at the end. But I'll start with probably the most important thing, if you move to the next slide, that we have found. And without this, all the other work is going to be possible, which is having a shared aim, and not an aspirational aim, but having a very clear, objectively measurable aim that everyone who's touching the rules or the policies, the resources, operationalizing those resources, are all agreed we're all working towards. This is collective accountability toward an end state. If you move to the next slide, and there are some principles that we've established around the definition of what it would look like to end homelessness in a community that felt really important, especially if you're going to use a continuous improvement or a quality improvement framework, which is the definition of what it means to end homelessness in a community has to be objective and replicable. So it has to mean the same thing in one community as it does in another. And it has to be observed in an objective way. So if I assess whether that community has met that standard, I would get the same result if Melanie assessed it. That the definition is standardized, but also recognizing that homelessness is a dynamic problem, right? It is always shifting. It isn't static. That the definition is simple and usable on the ground in a community. I think we've all seen like very complex definitions of end states that are very hard to measure, and take a lot of effort to measure, and you can't actually use it day to day to inform your work. And so what felt important to us is that the definition was something that was present all the time and how people were doing the work, and was simple to understand. And then maybe most importantly, that the definition of what it meant to kind of functionally end homelessness was credible to key people in that system, including people experiencing homelessness. And so not the practitioners in the field, people outside the field, that felt like a credible definition of what it meant to functionally end homelessness. Obviously, all of our shared objective is to have an absolute zero to homelessness, where no one ever experiences homelessness. But I think we want to lean into the fact that right now where we are is we aren't able to solve every upstream challenge. And if we just look at the homeless response system, and how we would know the homeless response system had done its job to functionally end homelessness, what would that look like? If you go to the next slide, I'll share what the measures we use within Built for Zero communities. So there's kind of 2 things we're looking at with communities. One is system, its outcomes. And so for each population, we're looking at, is the number of people experiencing homelessness at any given time less than or equal to your demonstrated positive exits from that system. So that can be housing placements, it could be reuniting with family for long-term housing, but it's a long-term permanent housing exit. And that's not based on, I think often in the past, this definition of functional zero has been confused with your system capacity. So we have this number of people experiencing homelessness and we have this many units, we must be at functional zero. If anyone's worked on this issue, you know, the challenge is really in implementation, how hard it is to match those units or those services with the actual people. And so this definition is not about the presence of capacity, it's about the demonstrated capability to implement the housing solution across that community. So at a very simple level, let's say on veterans homelessness, if you have 10 veterans experiencing homelessness at any given time, you would have had to demonstrate over the last 6 months that on average, you can permanently house at least 10 veterans. And so there's some more detail under these, which we're happy to go into in questions, but that's it at the simplest version. What this requires you to do though, if this is you agree, this is our shared aim, this is our definition of what it looks like to end homelessness, you have to know in real time how many people are experiencing homelessness. And that is what leads to the kind of data you would need to measure if changes are improvement and if you are moving closer to this outcome. In addition to systems outcomes, if you go to the next slide, there's also outcomes around equity. Are there indicators that you are building a system that can equitably end homelessness for populations across the system? So looking at things like system decision-making power, are people represented in the decision-making power of that system? What is the lived experience of people as they moved through that system? Are their needs being met with dignity and in a timely way? And can you look at your data, can you disaggregate your data by race and ethnicity and use that information to close disproportionality gaps in your system? So getting to an end to homelessness, meeting that system outcome definition is only as valuable as we've done that in an equitable way. And so with communities and Built for Zero, we're not only looking at the hard numbers, but the experience people are having, the ability to influence the system design and using that data to close disproportionality gaps. So that's the shared aim, that unless there's clear commitment to a measurable outcome, it will be very hard to move the needle and leverage all the rest of what we've seen in communities who've made progress. The next thing, if you move to the next slide, is the data. So do you have a rapid feedback loop of information that is giving you what you need to know if we're moving closer? Answer a lot of those questions that Simone posed at the front end. How will we know any of those things are true, and how do we know them in enough time to course correct? So if you go to the next slide, one of the first things we do when we work with communities who are part of Built for Zero is support them to get to a place where they have quality, what we call quality data across their jurisdiction. So this means across the continuum of care jurisdiction, we know how many people, at least monthly, are experiencing homelessness. And we have person level data in order to help meet the individual needs of that person, but we also can use the data at a systems level. So it's obviously really critical, if you go to the next slide, to have information that allows you to move someone from the street into permanent housing and meet their individual needs. And I think that is actually something our system is already very, very good at, knowing people by name, having their information. What we tend to be less good at is making sure we have comprehensive data across our system that represents the majority of the population experiencing homelessness at any given time, and using that information to do systems decision-making. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you an example of this. So this is information from data from Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm pretty sure it's on the veteran population. And what you're looking at is a run chart that's demonstrating month over month data on the number of veterans experiencing homelessness. And so at any meeting their team is having, they can look at how are we doing against the big goal of functional zero? Are there fewer people experiencing homelessness this month than last month? They can use their quality data not only to meet individual needs, do case conferencing, match people with the right resources, but they can also pull up and say, are all these programs and investments adding up to fewer people experiencing homelessness? And when it's not, they can say, okay, what is our hypothesis about the strategies that we might try that would drive a reduction? And so they're using that information to identify leverage points and do system level problem solving. That is, without that, then we're making guesses without data to inform those hypotheses and to also learn from. Did we see the result we expected? Next slide. In addition to, so you've got your shared aim, you've got quality data, this feedback loop of qualitative and quantitative data that's helping you understand if you're moving closer to that goal. And then obviously a really important piece of our work is using evidence-based interventions to test in that system. So if you move to the next slide, you'll see this is an example from Washington, D.C., again, of their veteran data. So they're able to look at their veteran data over time. So this is every month, how many veterans are experiencing homelessness. And they're also able to annotate this run chart with what was happening in that month. What were we trying? Did that lead to fewer people experiencing homelessness? And they can tell the story of the work they're doing and what impact it had along the way. And so the strategies and interventions that they're testing, whether it's standing up a new permanent supportive housing building, whether it's testing a different way to enroll folks in HUD-VASH and partner with SSVF, whatever the thing is, they're using that inside that data to test a hypothesis rather than assume upfront, if we just implement these 10 best practices, we expect to get to fewer people experiencing homelessness. That may happen, it may not, but they can tell that story and really learn from it. So starting to see the collection of best practice in our sector as a menu of options that need to be tested and iterated in your context versus a recipe for how you get to an end state. Next slide. I think we can just keep going. Next slide. And then the last thing I'll talk about before I hand it over to Melanie is flexible resources. So we've seen in communities that have driven reductions or gotten to zero, how critical having flexible resources are to be responsive to the data. If you move to the next slide, if we lean into homelessness as a dynamic problem that's changing all the time, and we're going to use data to inform how we pivot and course correct, often we then need we need resources to allow us to quickly try different things. And one really great example is from Bakersfield, Kern County, who is working on ending chronic homelessness among adults. And were kind of stuck around 60 chronically homeless adults and had a hypothesis this was about access to units in the community. And so in July of 2018, they hosted a landlord event to get more landlords to commit units. And they actually got landlords to commit almost 80 units, more than they needed, 80 units of housing. But what happened, as you can see, they had that event in July and the numbers did not get better. And that was because operationalizing, converting those units, matching them with people was the real challenge between there. And so they went back to the drawing board and said, okay, we tried that. It didn't work the way that we thought it would. What's our hypothesis about what we should try now based on what we've learned? And in the spring of 2019, they had a list of other things they were going to try. And as part of that, one of the things that they needed was an investment to really surge those ideas. And we were able to go to Kaiser Permanente as an anchor institution partner to quickly, within 30 days, help them bring on a pretty significant investment that resulted, as you can see, in them driving sustained reductions very, very quickly and getting that number from 60 down to under 3. And so that idea of having money that you can pull on very quickly to try things that sometimes you may not work out as well as their hypothesis did, but allows you to learn very, very quickly and be responsive to what the data is telling you, rather than be responsive to what the problem was a year ago when you applied for, public or private dollars. We've seen as really critical. Next slide. So the last thing, probably, in addition to that shared aim and data, one of the most critical pieces are your implementation structures. Like, all of this is a great idea unless you have the vehicle to really implement. And I'm going to hand it over to Melanie to talk about this last piece.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. So as Beth mentioned, I'll kind of go through this last section. I think it's going to reinforce a lot of the themes that you've heard mentioned. But the last piece of this operating system is really about having effective implementation and governance structures that are capable of achieving these population level outcomes. Next slide. And I think to understand how these structures affect change in a community, we also need to acknowledge that there are different opportunities or types of leverage points within a system. And one of these is what we call kind of structural change. So it's the work that I think many people on this call do day in and day out. So thinking about things like laws, policies, fundings, interventions that have the ability to set an overall tone and direction of the work, and to impact really fundamental change within our systems and communities. If you go to the next slide. The second area of leverage within our systems is the technical space. And Beth mentioned some of these examples as well. So this is where the work gets done on the ground and on the front line. So thinking about things like best practice and service delivery, how we're scaling up housing models, how data gets collected within our local systems, that's something that we can refer to as more of the technical space of service delivery. Next slide. But then the piece that I think is often forgotten is this space here in the middle. And that's what we have started calling the implementation space. And this is where everything gets translated from sweeping structural change to how we actually see impact on the ground and in our neighborhoods. And this is an area where we're thinking about how systems and processes work, how we collaborate and work with each other across communities, how we're actually using the data that's being collected to drive action. And we need all of these three layers working together if we're going to accomplish transformational change, which I think is what we all hope to see. Next slide. And what we've learned over the course of Built for Zero and our work of the last several years is that we need these implementation structures to fill in that middle piece, but we also need these to be working together at all levels. I think historically, a lot of homeless response efforts in our country have been focused on policy and funding or the more structural type solutions at the federal level. And then we're thinking about very technical or best practice responses within our local communities. And just to be really clear, we need both of those things. We need those to continue in a very effective way. But what we also need is to focus on how change gets implemented. And I think also the critical role that states play in connecting these pieces. And we need effective backbone organizations or intermediaries that are working at each of these levels, moving towards that same shared aim to help us get to the ultimate outcome of less people experiencing homelessness in our communities. Next slide. So within Built for Zero, we are now partnering with leaders at all levels to think about what an effective implementation structure needs to look like to drive the outcomes that we're all working towards. So across the country, we're working with local intermediaries. These are often continuums of care, maybe city or county governments, but this could be an organization like a United Way or some other entity that is leading and convening in this space. But they're bringing folks together at a local level around that shared aim, thinking about alignment of resources, building strategic partnerships, system design, collecting quality data, and I think also looking at system staffing capacity. So how are we bringing people together to really support and drive this work in the way that's needed for it to be effective? Next slide. And we're also partnering with folks at the state level. So we have intermediaries who are leading public-private partnerships. One of those are friends at Away Home Washington, who you'll hear from here in a moment. But we do also have state government partnerships where those folks are playing that backbone or intermediary role to guide the efforts across their state. And we've been working in Colorado and Maine for the last few years and have a new partnership in Oregon. Next slide. And then the last layer, and you heard Beth also mention this at the very beginning, is that we have local efforts, state efforts across the world. We have other national efforts that are supporting the work of these local teams, where we now have Built for Zero-like efforts in Canada, the UK, France, and Australia, who are also working towards a similar measure towards functional zero and seeing communities meet that goal. And I think the critical point in all of this is that all of these levels and all of these pieces are aligned and building on each other. So they're working towards shared aims, setting strategy, using data the same way. What are we working towards? How are we using data to measure that progress? And then the different levels of state and national leaders are helping clear the path for local communities to be in direct response to the barriers that are surfacing from the ground. And with that, we will wrap up our portion. I just want to thank everyone again for the time this morning. We're thrilled that this conversation is happening in California, and we're just honored to be part of the conversation. And I will turn it back over to Simone.
Thank you, Beth and Melanie, so much for sharing and for joining us today. And remember, if you have questions, please do submit them through the questions box. We're collecting them. We've gotten some so far. We're collecting them, and we will go over as many as we can today. We'll cover as many as we can during the Q&A session. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to Julie Patino and Ashley Barnes-Cock from Away Home Washington to talk about their Anchor Community Initiative that they lead in the state of Washington.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. Ashley and I are really excited to share with you the work of Away Home Washington. I'm going to start off a little bit kind of telling the tale of our evolution as an organization, because it is really unique. And honestly, I suspect that California has some of the same energy that that can be brought together to kind of catalyze some really powerful action. But essentially, our state is really unique in that we have a really strong history of focus on youth and young adult homelessness, and a number of both public and private champions. And by private champions, I mean really philanthropic partners that center their focus on young people and homelessness. And they do that, actually, a number of our funders are national level funders. They support the work of Community Solutions and are very well versed in the impact model. And so we have that really right in our backyard. Even at an executive level, we have a governor that served multiple terms, and his wife, the First Lady, Mrs. Inslee, actually serves as the co-chair of Away Home Washington and is there in more than just name. We're talking about someone who shows up to our long sessions that we'll do, our couple-hour briefing sessions, and stays the entire time, and has really been a true champion. So not just in name. We also have a lot of very organized, lived experience youth advocates in our state, and they've spent a lot of time and energy changing narratives, having roles in systems change work at the state level and on different councils. So there is a history of sort of efficacy of young people being involved in this work and having a say. As we know, homeless policy is really typically set at kind of the COC or community level, or frankly, the federal level. And kind of towards that end, we recognized in Washington State in 2015 that we really needed a state presence, kind of an intra-agency type entity that could go across sort of all spheres of government and really be our state seat, if you will, for youth and young adult homelessness issues. So in 2015, the state established the Office of Homeless Youth, again, really undergirded by the efforts of those public and private partners coming together and championing this need. This office has really been charged with coordinating youth homeless services and supports, and increasing coordination and convening power. They also, frankly, manage and coordinate our state investments around youth and young adult homeless interventions. They are our partners in really removing barriers. And as was spoken about before, they also are an entity that really is looking to moving forward to how can we have more cogent data picture that's real time across the state. And that's a role we play with that entity to really get aligned real-time quality data systems. So again, this office was really formed of a distinct need to really kind of drive results and make sure that the public investments really were efficacious. And it sort of led us into this, this world of exploring the community solutions model. And so that model was brought to our state and frankly iterated, and we can go to the next slide, please, really iterated to form Away Home Washington. So I'm just going to do a little brief overview. Again, I'm sort of getting into Away Home Washington and our genesis story. Ashley's going to be sharing with you kind of going into a deeper dive about what is the Anchor Community Initiative model that we utilize that embodies sort of the backbone of the community solutions model, but our iterative version of that tailored to youth and young adults and who are unaccompanied and experiencing homelessness. And also, you know, how the ACI works in communities and with communities in a very community-driven and community-centric way. And then we'd love to share with you our successes and learnings. It's always nice to get learnings from someone else who kind of had to do some of the stumbling and get back up again. And we have plenty of those that we'd love to share with you. And then we obviously want to open it up for questions after. So next slide, please. So I think we can go to the next one. Thank you. So again, this public-private partnership really kind of wraps around communities in many respects. So the Office of Homeless Youth, which you'll probably hear us refer to as OHY, is our key partner and player. And fundamentally, we want to be in lockstep with them because we recognize that a lot of those investments are from public sources. And frankly, the buck stops with them in terms of really being at the seat to really have a statewide data infrastructure. And really starting with the communities that we're in, we're able to really inform their work, but we're all really driving towards that goal and advocating for that. The philanthropic partners, as I said, are very invested in this work. Quite literally, they fund us as the backbone entity, so the communities do not really absorb that cost. So that allows us to have a broad breadth of TA and coaching assistance that you'll learn about from Ashley that we're able to offer. So they really, our philanthropic partners are truly leaders in the systems change reform. I will also say that the beauty of having our philanthropic partners too is that they are able to pivot in really agile ways that sometimes it takes a while for other forces to move and really embrace innovations. So we really appreciate their expertise in this area as well. They're very well versed and expert in youth and young adult homelessness, and it really helps to have partners who understand the work and can move with you and be responsive to what's happening at the local level. We can go to the next slide, please. So we have a mantra at Away Home Washington, and it really is in many respects what we would consider our overarching aim as an organization. And that is that we envision a Washington state where every young person can access the services they need and want quickly without having to leave their home community, and that they are stably housed as a result of that response. So really a system that frankly is often built for saying no to young people. No, we don't have that service. No, we don't have that bed. No, we don't have that housing opportunity. No, we cannot think outside of the box. How do we rewire that system to really be asset-based and responsive in real time to young people? That is our aim. Next slide, please. So when we talk about building a yes to yes community, quite specifically, we are talking about functionally ending youth and young adult homeless and not just managing or responding to it. So there is an affirmative component there. You know, Beth mentioned, you know, this upstream and the inflow of folks into the system. That is something that we absolutely care about and is part of this work as well as having a system built for making sure that the young people who come into it are not having a repeat instance of homelessness, and that if they are going to experience homelessness, it is absolutely very, very brief. And that the system knows whether or not it's brief, and that really requires this data fidelity. And then also it has to be justice driven. We know that disproportionality, you know, I saw your numbers in California ours are the same. It's the same all over the country. If we do not pay attention to the disparate impact on young people of color and queer young people and those who have those intersectional identities, we are never going to end homelessness. And so not for a moment do we neglect that as part of our aim of our work. And then we also, as you've heard from our partners at Community Solutions, having real-time data allows us so many insights from the what we call sort of humanistic data level of solving for that young person in front of us, to being able to make systems alterations and changes and removing blocks. So it's absolutely vital to this work. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So overall, Away Home Washington really encompasses the model that you'll learn more about that when Ashley presents. But I have to say that we also recognize our role as a systems player ourselves, and that we serve a really strong advocacy role. And that advocacy role is really related to expansion of services for young people, but it's also about removing barriers that we're uniquely situated to see because we work across the state and across communities, and be able to be a player in sort of the state legislative space and the state policy space, and really leverage our power and influence and insight into communities with communities to make these changes and advocate for increases of services where they're needed. Really, that advocacy is sort of given wings when we look at the continuous system. You know, we really believe that dumping more money into broken system will not solve the problem. So we use targeted coaching and data support that we offer to each community to target system and process improvements to redesign their homeless systems in ways that make sense and drive results. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about young people, just to be clear, we are talking about unaccompanied young people in the age range of age 12 to 24. What I do want to highlight is that we do not utilize the HUD definition of homelessness. We utilize a definition that contemplates not only young people living in places unfit for human habitation or that are unsheltered, or fleeing domestic violence or trafficking, but really looking at young people who are unsafely or unstably couch surfing or doubled up, or who are sheltered in some manner in an unsafe way. It's really important that we have these more expansive views, not only from a justice-driven perspective, but also because it's more in alignment with the lived experience of young people. And so it's important for this to be inclusive, and it's something that we absolutely insist on and is reflected in our data collection as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to talk more in depth about the Anchor Community Initiative and how it really sort of embodies the model that we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie, and welcome everybody. I'm super happy to be here. I've been with Away Home Washington for the past 3 years as I started as our coach for our communities, and now for the past couple of years have had the privilege of directing this initiative, and I'm super excited to talk to you about it in depth today. You can go to the next slide. So ACI is our flagship program at Away Home Washington. And I just want to reemphasize that Beth and Mel were there at the start, and our partnership with Community Solutions has really allowed us to learn from each other and grow together and build up a lot of these frameworks and all these things together. And the Anchor Community Initiative works intensively with diverse communities across the state to test, try, and learn what it truly takes in individual communities to house all the young people coming into our system, roughly in 30 days or less, ensure every young person has immediate access to shelter, and ensure that there are equitable outcomes for LGBTQ youth and youth of color throughout our system. So what you've heard so far, when we say end, we don't mean that no young person will ever experience any kind of crisis. What we mean is that our communities are actively designing and redesigning their systems to ensure that every single young person has an immediate pathway forward towards something they need and want, and no young person who needs support is turned away. We want systems, like Julie said, that say yes to young people. And when a community joins the ACI, you can hit the next little animation. I love an animation. When a community joins the ACI, we are welcoming them in with us in this movement to play around with us and to play around with each other and push the limits of what's possible, proving that with the right sauce, we really can end youth and young adult homelessness. And if we can do it in one place, we can learn better what it takes to end it across our entire state. You can go to the next slide. So what ACI brings to communities is a model. So each community has what we call a core improvement team, which has access to a lead coach, who strategizes with them and supports their local teams in planning, as well as expert data solution support and targeted technical assistance to support them in organizing young people with lived experience to lead this work. Communities are all supported to build community-wide youth action boards as a component of their work together, which you'll see in a second. But we start with supporting anchor communities to build the relationships and infrastructure to know, as you've heard so far, all of the unique young people experiencing homelessness in real time, while creating that kind of baseline level of youth engagement in the work. Then we start coaching communities to use our data to set specific short-term aims to drive overall reductions in homelessness, including around ending disproportionality for youth of color, LGBTQ youth, and trans and gender nonconforming young people. That is where we are in our process with our cohort 1 communities. And after that, we make that final push to reducing to functional zero, and sustaining that gain. And we start with data because not every change we make is an improvement to the system, and we cannot see what is working if we cannot trust our data. And our communities would say that as well. You can go to the next slide. So this is kind of what our initiative looks like on some level. The red is all kind of the things that we do and we offer, and the blue is all the things that are happening in our local communities, our local community teams. So we provide specific data and evaluation support. We provide access to a lead coach that does a lot of like the strategizing, connecting with other resources and subject matter experts, like thinking through problems, giving feedback, lots of those kinds of things. And then we provide also targeted youth engagement TA. So we have a specific coach that is dedicated to making sure that the people who are executing youth action or who are creating youth action boards and the young people in our initiative feel supported and like leaders and as full members of the initiative that we have. And so we have that support as well. We use pass-through dollars to fund capacity for the youth action boards and staffing and stipends, because young people should be paid for their work, paid for their expertise, and as well as for the coordinator role. The lead and the data role, which make up that dark blue kind of leadership team on the ground in each community, those are not funded by us. And we see this as like there's a component of us supporting communities to add capacity and them adding that in partnership together. So we're buying into this initiative and this like work together is kind of how we see it. You can go to the next page. So we just expanded this year and we now have 9 communities. So we have cohort 1, cohort 2, 9 communities covering 10 counties across the state. So it's 27% of Washington state. These communities are geographically diverse, they are population diverse, and each bring their own different strengths and challenges to this movement together to learn together. You can go to the next slide. I really want to talk about data because as we've been talking about up to this point, it's really the foundation of everything. And if there's one thing that I have learned from doing this over the past 3 years is that taking the time to get the data right will pay dividends for communities being able to reduce in the future. When communities feel that they can trust their data, they often feel like they have solid ground finally underneath their feet in this space of like change. That is a really critical thing to get people to take risks and take action and try things that maybe feel scary or different. And so data can help us have a leg to stand on. So can you go to the next slide? So I'm not going to super go into what a by name list is because we talked about that a lot. I think the thing I want to say about a by name list is that all of our communities, we ask them to have a by name list. And a by name list is used first and foremost to house young people. Communities use it for case conferencing, which is a critical strategy that is used across the country. Community solutions communities use it as well. It's really impactful process that takes a whole community approach to solving and connecting young people to housing resources. It's also a really valuable tool, the by name list, that provides insights into what's happening in the system. It can highlight where there's housing gaps and equity issues, and it serves as a benchmark for assessing whether a community's data remains quality. But this isn't just about having a by name or an accurate list. It's not just about having a number on a dashboard. It is also, and Beth Sandor is one of the people who I think about when I think about this. The goal here is that communities know all of the young people experiencing homelessness in their communities. It's not just that there's a number there and we want the number to go down. We obviously do, but it is part of this process. The hope is that it is a process of getting to actually know the people, the humans, and making sure every single one of them has a plan. You can go to the next slide. So these are all of the different system level data points that our communities collect each month. They track inflow, people coming into the system. They track the folks who are experiencing active homelessness, and they track who is leaving the system. So how are people moving in, and what is happening to them in the mix of this? And we also collect all of this disaggregated information on the bottom. So age, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity, to be able to drill down into where there are inequities in the system. So for example, communities might see in their data that LGBTQ young people of color are experiencing a disproportionate rate of unsheltered homelessness compared to their cis hetero and white peers. Or their data might show that young people are returning from permanent housing at a higher rate. Young people of color are returning to housing at a higher rate over the past 3 months, and be able to pinpoint where does a change need to happen, because we all know about systemic oppression and biases, that it's a lot of things that you would not necessarily see unless you were actively looking for it. And they can use their learnings in real time to pivot when needed. And so when we look at our definition of functional zero, we really believe that it's critical to develop and design tools and coaching support that help communities drive at those reductions in disproportionality, because systems will not naturally correct for inequities. That just won't happen unless we actively try to build justice-driven systems. And Simone, if you could let me share my screen, I just want to show you what the dashboards kind of look like when you are playing around with this information. It's one thing to have all of these data points listed up in front of you, but you can see things. So this is Spokane's data. You can look here at our dashboards and see how many people are newly identified in the system. And you can see right there, inflow versus outflow, right? You want fewer people to be coming into the system if it's working, and more people to be exiting the system, because that's the only way that the overall number goes down, is if fewer people are coming in, more people are leaving. So this shows you your breakdown here, and you can see how many people are being moved to inactive. Is everybody being moved to inactive? Or are most of the people actually getting permanently housed, which is what we want to have happen. We don't just want people to go missing. We want them to have a plan. You can see things like this is our housing placements over time. So it's really easy to be able to tell okay, our goal is to get over our median and be able to transform the data so that we can take what is in a giant spreadsheet of HMIS, homeless management information system data, and transform it into something that communities can actually use for decision making. We can see, okay, there's inflow by race and ethnicity. So we can see for youth of color, for example, what is happening in the inflow for this population or any of these populations. Who is coming into the system, who is exiting it, and what does that tell us? And one thing I just want to highlight from what Beth and Mel said is, see this number is going up here in Spokane, and that is something that we don't want to see. We want to see the numbers going down because Spokane is one of our communities that has seen a negative shift in homelessness. So, and their overall youth and young adult population, and so we don't want to see the number after they've reduced to go back up again. So one of the things that we started doing as just an example of kind of how we work with communities, we started talking on our team, what is going on here? What is our hypothesis of what could possibly be happening? And we made a decision to go talk to the community and be like, can we just do a session and deep dive into the inflow into the system? What is actually happening here? One of the things that we just found out in the past week, once we dug into the data, is that there's a data quality issue that is resulting in maybe 130 people on this list as actually have not been moved to inactive, even though they are inactive in the actual system according to the system-wide policy. And so this number actually, 330, actually should be way down here. And they're going to resubmit the data and be able to re-see it. So that idea about like when you see a problem, how fast can you pivot? This allows us to be able to do that. The only other thing I want to show here is like we can see things like, just if we want to target unsheltered, let's look at unsheltered here. Let's take a look at doubled up and couch surfing. Like, who are these young people? And what is this information telling us? What do we think is happening here to create the ups and downs that we're seeing and the trends that we're seeing? So that is really some of the value of having real-time quality data that you can use. You can go back to the slide deck. Thank you. And you can go 2 slides ahead. And as you can see here, Walla Walla, one of our local communities, has reached a reduction shift in February of this year. So this is a run chart showing the total number of young people actively experiencing homelessness from April 2021 to February 2022. And this chart is telling us that the system improvements that Walla Walla has been implementing over the last year are having some kind of measurable, sustained impact. They have reduced the number and they are holding that reduction. And it's clear that Walla Walla is successfully redesigning their system in a measurable way by preventing young people from experiencing homelessness in the first place, reducing inflow, housing young people quickly, and keeping them permanently housed. Those are all things that impact the number of young people experiencing active homelessness. This is a 60% reduction over this period of time for Walla Walla. You can go to the next slide. And this here is an 80% reduction in the number of young people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in Walla Walla. We also have annotated run charts, similarly to what Beth and Mel showed for this. And I would be happy to share the Walla Walla case study that goes into all of the reasons why we think this has happened and the Walla Walla community thinks this has happened in their community. But this level of data is really powerful because communities can see their areas for improvement in their homelessness response continuum, and they can see if changes they're making are having an impact in real time. If not, they can pivot quickly and continue that quality improvement process because this is a dynamic issue. Walla Walla now has the capacity to use their data to tell that story that we were talking about. Just for the sake of time, I'm gonna have you, can you jump ahead like couple slides? Next one, this one. I want to just talk a little bit about like what it means. Like when we say we don't want to pour more money into a broken system, you know, I think it's important to think about like where are communities just like lacking the fundamental resources to even have, for example, quality data. You cannot have 100% geographic outreach coverage if you have no outreach workers, which was a situation that Walla Walla was in for when they started as an anchor community. They had no young adult programs at all. So they needed a base level of investment to be able to even think about like improving a service system. They didn't have one. And now they do. But then you want to think about with communities, like what are the kinds of things that they would even change that like actually don't cost any money to be able to improve their system to get higher outcomes. And so I want to talk about Walla Walla's prepaid debit card situation. And like a lot of communities, every community, basically, Walla Walla has a really tight housing market. We have supported each of our communities to set up what we call a homeless prevention and diversion fund. And that requires providers to make a request for funds from a central administrator who can then cut a check within 72 hours. That timeline is ambitious. Not a lot of agencies can do that. And it does not work for everything. For example, it does not work when you're trying to submit rental applications when it goes up 20 minutes later. The unit is gone. And so the top 2 providers who do most of the prevention and diversion requests for Walla Walla, they said, could we just like get a prepaid debit card from the central administration, so a different agency entirely? Can we get a prepaid debit card so that we can like just use it for rental applications? And they doubled their housing placement rate. by implementing this one change that didn't cost any money. And there's like a little bit of a fear-based mindset, like, is there going to be fraud? Like, there's all these things that come up when you start talking about gift cards and things like that. But they worked out a system, and none of their fears actually came to pass. And so they have never gone back from doing this. This one change doubled their housing placement rate almost immediately. The second one I want to just touch on really briefly is Spokane's Next Step Form. So these two communities have measurably reduced youth homelessness and have seen a sustained shift. The third and fourth communities in the country to do that after Rockford and Gulf Coast Community Solutions communities for youth and young adults. And so a thing I want to highlight from Spokane is that really they at one point noticed that their moves to inactive was way high. And specifically when they dove into their data, they saw that most of the young people that they were moving to inactive had just one contact for a coordinated entry assessment, and then they vanished. So one touch point and then they were gone. So the team asked young people what was happening, and they told them, we do an assessment and it isn't clear what is supposed to happen next, who I'm supposed to call, how would I know what my prioritization means? Nothing. So we just don't, why would we keep contacting the system? And so they developed this next step form, which I can share with folks, to give every single young person that gets assessed, which dramatically reduced their moves to inactive. And the thing that's important about this is that they saw 6 months later that the moves to inactive started creeping up again. So they got all the providers in a room and they said, what's happening? Why is it going up? Is the form not actually the solution to this? And they said, we're not implementing the form. And they re-implemented the form and drove it back down. That is one of the things that I think is really important about kind of using this as a continuous, way to support folks, is that like one change, implementing it, hitting on a good idea does not always solve the problem in perpetuity, but having access to the data allows communities to go back and catch these things and pivot. And so I think that is one of the things that's really important. If you could go ahead, youth expertise, I think as this illustrates, is very key to the process. They know what the problems are. They know where the holes are because they fell through them, and they have the best ideas for solving for those things. I think if you go to the next slide, I'll share a key learning, and Julie can share a key learning. I know we're out of time. But I think that it's important to expect, and in a journey, if you all undertake this journey, to expect that communities are going to learn, and there's going to be barriers that we run into. There's going to be things that communities tell us at a higher level, these things need to change. And we need to be prepared to change along with them and learn with them, and create a container for them to be able to make mistakes, because that is the thing that's going to allow them the freedom to be able to hit on what it really takes. And I will pass it to Julie or Simone. Simone, I know we're low on time.
Yeah, Julie, did you want to share something before we move on?
Well, we did have this sort of enumeration of key learnings. Yeah, I don't know if you want us to go through some of those right quick.
Sure. I mean, let's take one more minute and then we can move on.
Okay, could we go to the next slide then?
Sure. Oh, there's no more slides.
It's in the notes, Julie.
Oh, okay. Oops, sorry. Then maybe I'm going to pivot to you, Ashley, because you have the notes up. I just closed them. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I think one of the other things is that you really have to believe that it's possible to end youth homelessness. You cannot do this work if you don't believe, and you cannot do it if communities don't believe. I think it's really important to identify like who are the early adopters, like who are the thought leaders in communities who are going to like jump into this feet first, and really believe in it with you. Because if you are trying to do everybody in the whole state in a model like this, it is going to be like pulling teeth to get them, to get people who like are not bought in to do it. The best thing is to get people who are committed, who believe in the model, and get them to prove it. And that will bring everybody else along. One of the things that Mel and Ryan say to me often is, right, like the best thing that it will be for your movement in Washington State is getting one community across the finish line, because once you prove it, then the floodgates will open up. And so I think targeting your support where it will be the most value added to those communities is going to be key. I think there's an important thing to say about money. Like, I think, like I said, it's important to set up some infrastructure on the front end, but communities are very likely a few years in to have much better way of identifying like what are the most highest leverage interventions that we could try after we have pushed our system as hard as we can in the things that don't necessarily cost money, or are like requiring like pivoting of funding resources that already exist, right? When we pushed it as far as it can go, we know what we need and we know what all those young people need because we know them. And I think that's really important thing that we have learned, because one of our key things is supporting communities to advocate for resources. So those are some things that I would say.
Thank you, Ashley and Julie, for walking us through Washington's journey and your Anchor Community Initiative. I think you definitely made the case for real-time data. I mean, it's just so compelling how much you can do when you know what's happening in the moment. So thanks for doing that and sharing your learnings with us. And I think we'll obviously definitely continue to clock your, watch your progress and see what happens and how this rolls out in your state. I think now for all of us Californians on the call, I know we're all thinking sort of, well, where can we go from here? We're in a different place than Washington, and then a lot of the communities that Community Solutions works with. And, we've certainly been considering this here at JBay. From our vantage point, we think there are a lot of opportunities right now that make this the right time to really move the needle on functionally ending youth homelessness. And I just want to talk about what we think some of those opportunities are, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I think first, there's an existing framework. We just learned about it today. Communities across the country are working toward functional zero homelessness and some youth homelessness using either the Built for Zero approach or some adaptation of it. Second, there's existing precedent here in California. So number one, you heard Bakersfield, Kern, like there are communities, they might not be working specifically toward functionally ending youth homelessness, but they are working toward, maybe it's chronic homelessness, maybe it's veterans, it's some subpopulation. And the governor last year announced a stated goal of reaching functional zero family homelessness through a series of existing investments and expanded and new investments. And this includes a new program called the Family Homelessness Challenge Grants and Technical Assistance Program, which we were kind of looking at, like this could be a vehicle to replicate maybe for young people to, bring some version of the framework described today forward in California. Third, we talked a little bit about the California Interagency Council on Homelessness, but you heard Washington State and some other states have an Office of Homeless Youth. And I often hear people say that's really key to moving the needle here. While we don't have an Office of Homeless Youth, we do have a council dedicated to homelessness with 5 explicit goals related to youth homelessness. And so I'm looking at that as glass half full. We do have an entity, a body here that is thinking about all of that and doing that work. Fourth, there is a demonstrated motivation and commitment to ending youth homelessness here in California, we believe. One thing I think that demonstrates this, and this isn't the only thing, obviously, but just an example, is that several California communities have applied over the last several years for the Federal Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, YHDP. They wouldn't be doing that if they weren't poised to work toward ending youth homelessness. There is a lot of interest in working on this. And 7 communities in California in total have been awarded YHDP grants from HUD over the since 2016, and additional communities have applied and just not been awarded. And YHDP provides some part of the funding is about creating a plan to address and end youth homelessness. So I think that speaks that says a lot. Fifth, recent sizable investments in youth homelessness. So obviously, it does take money to do things, and there's been new investment over the last several years in youth homelessness. And lastly, just citing some of the progress that I shared earlier, there has been some decrease, it appears, at least with this preliminary point in time count data, and likely as a result of that sizable investment. So, you know, how can California sort of meet the moment? I think just to scratch the surface here, there's a lot of things that could go on this slide, but two things that we're really thinking about here at J-Bay are, you know, we'd love to see the California's large one-time investment made through HAP. We'd love to see that change to an ongoing funding commitment. We know that we have a little bit of a runway with HAP. It's committed, you know, it does provide sort of funding that, you know, will last for some period of years, you know, through 2027 of how it's committed currently. But even if we reached functional zero, you do need to sustain it. You need you don't just turn around and give up all your progress. So there does need to be money to sustain it. And we know that local communities need commitment. Like they can't operate without knowing that they can count on money. So to continue their programming. So we know that that's a really important piece of this puzzle. Second, I sort of hinted at this earlier, but I think we want to consider how to establish, you know, a framework similar to what was described today for working toward achieving functional zero for youth homelessness. And that would require some, you know, state level and community level, you know, technical assistance in the establishment of data infrastructure to measure progress and identify, you know, needed changes in real time and impact. And so one thought could be to replicate, you know, the family homelessness challenge and do something similar for young people. So those are just some thoughts. We're going to continue to think about these things here at J-Bay, and we'll certainly continue conversations about these things with stakeholders across the state and keep the conversation going. I'd like now to turn it over to Q&A, move into Q&A. We do have questions that have been sent to us. I'm going to read them. You can continue to enter questions if you'd like. We also have our emails here on the screen. So if we don't get to everyone's question today and you have a specific follow-up you'd like to make, you can do so with those email addresses. So first question is just about homeless definitions. So I think some of this might have been answered in the presentation, but doesn't hurt to share twice because a lot of information was shared. And I think this is for Beth and Melanie. Does each community, all the communities that you've worked with across the US, does each community use the same sort of HUD homeless definition? How are they operating with definitions?
Yes, so we're using the same, in the adult space, we're using the HUD definitions. In the youth space, maybe Ashley, you could talk about this. It's more, and I think Julie, you mentioned it too, like it's more expansive because of the unique nature of youth homelessness. So I don't know if either one of you want to talk about that. But I'll say the operating principle though, is that we all need to be using the same shared definitions of things so that we can compare apples to apples and measure like what's happening across multiple communities. But on youth homelessness, it's a little more expansive. Julie or Ashley, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, Ashley, if you could say a little bit more, but I also just kind of want to add that I think there are only a few communities in the country that have kind of iterated your model or the community solutions model to youth and young adults. Is that correct? I know you have some.
We're working right. Yeah, right now we're working probably with about 20 communities that are, in addition to working on adult homelessness, are working in youth. So Built for Zero, the goal of the work we're doing with communities in Built for Zero is to end homelessness for all populations, but to start with one and kind of scale out from there. So as Julie mentioned, there are some communities that have ended for veteran and chronic and now are working on ending for everyone. And so, but even there are some communities in Built for Zero who are starting with youth or are working at youth at the same time they're working on adult populations. So it's a mixed bag in our space. I think the thing that I want to say that before Julie and Ashley jump in on the definition, just listening to you all talk, that I feel like I want to get across the questions I saw in the chat is this approach, this model, this way of working is about working differently versus the specific interventions like Spokane Youth, which are good and important. But the real thing that unlocks the change is working functionally differently as a system and being focused on this end state and using data to iterate. And so I think within that, there are a lot of great interventions, but I feel like, Simone, I just wanted to get that across because I think if people walk away only with like, what were the interventions Walla Walla used, you'll miss that Walla Walla is functionally working radically different than they were before ACI.
Ashley, did you want to share about the homeless youth definition that you talked about earlier?
Yes. So community, like all of our communities basically like jumped on board with adopting like our definition, and there are like lots of battlegrounds around the definition of youth and adult homelessness, especially because like Chapin Hall has said young people who are doubled up in couch surfing in their big landmark study don't show better outcomes than young people who are experiencing literal homelessness, and that has been huge, I think. But right, there is the federal McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness, which includes people who lack a fixed, regular, or adequate housing, fixed, regular, or adequate housing. And then there is like the overall HUD definition and the way that prioritization happens. And so one of the things that has been really useful to us is figuring out how we can leverage our partnerships and our state level advocacy to ensure that there are housing projects that young people are eligible for. One of the things that I dropped in because somebody asked about prevention is like the reason I believe that our couch surfing and doubled up data is accurate in our dashboard. Like it wouldn't be if there was no housing programs that young people could access, because there's no reason to put a young person in HMIS if there's nothing that they will be eligible for. And so all 4 of our cohort 1 anchor communities, hopefully all 9 very soon, will have access to a flexible resource called Homeless Prevention and Diversion Fund that I can share all the resources for that we have with you all. But it provides flexible dollars that can be used with a very broad eligibility, and people in schools, people across the system who might not be your typical homeless youth service providers can access that, access it directly to house young people exactly where they are, or like as some of our communities say, like take the surf out of couch surfing and make those situations more stable and more secure. And so I think in order to actualize a broader definition of youth homelessness, you have to have the resources in some ways to back it up, because otherwise service providers are not going to put young people through the process of getting them in HMIS in the first place. Thank
you. One thing that I just want to say, people are asking if you can share the next step form, if we're able to maybe share that to registrants. Is that possible? Great. Here's another question for Ashley and Julie. How is data collected, stored, and managed? This person says their continuum of care uses HMIS as the main database, but a lot of the TAE partners, so providers serving young people, do not participate in it. What can you share there?
Yes, so we have iterated a version of what Community Solutions and us call the by name list scorecard, and it is basically a process of communities working through a list of questions. They're like, do you have documented policies and protocols to ensure that students experiencing homelessness are being able to be added to your by name list? Do you have 100% geographic outreach coverage? Can you track like current living situations so we can document what the length of time is? So it basically goes through all of these. It's like kind of like a work plan that the communities have to figure out, like for our community and where we are, what is happening right now, how can we have the relationships, the infrastructure, and the policies and procedures in place in our communities to be able to trust our data. And so there's kind of like a little bit of this by name list scorecard, which I can also share. I'm on our ACI resource hub. All of these things that I'm referencing are all on it, so they're easily accessible for everybody. But that is the process that communities go through in order to have some level of confidence in their data. And one of those things is like, how do we get our community like on board and people to be able to track who is in HMIS or not? So there's a series of questions that basically, like Beth said, it's about getting your community to work differently. So the ask is like, how are you going to say yes to this question? Like, how are you going to, like my question back to you would be like, how are you going to figure out like how to have a by name list that you can trust, given the situation that you're in? What's point A, and then where are we trying to get to, and closing that gap during that kind of first period of time.
Thank you. Well, I know we didn't get through many questions because these are dynamic questions, dynamic answers. But like I said, the information is on the screen there if you do want to follow up with any individual on the webinar and get your question answered, because I'm sorry to say we did not get to answer them all. But I know that a lot of people have chatted and just have consistently asked, is this going to be available, this recording, this slide deck? Yes, it is. We will send it to you today, later today, both the recording and the slide deck, and it'll be available on our website. So just wanted to answer that. And so we will send you the next step form that people are asking about. And I think you also said the by name list scorecard, right, Ashley? Okay, fantastic. Well, I want to thank all of everyone who attended today. Thank you so much. I know it's a busy time, especially for those in the legislature that have bill signing activities happening right now. We appreciate you joining. And, you know, definitely want to thank our panelists for taking the time today to share what's happening with the work that they're doing. And we definitely will keep in touch with them and also share with what we're working on here in California. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the week.